Hello, welcome, and thank you for being part of this WorkSafe webinar, The Safe Use of Elevating Work Platforms, or EWPs. My name is Chris McKenzie. I'll be your host for today's session. And this afternoon, we will be exploring the following topics. Updates to the standards for the safe use of EWPs, an overview of the training that is required to use them safely, and ways to mitigate risks while using EWPs. And today we're being joined by two WorkSafe Victoria experts to do just that. We've got James Webster with us, who's a Senior Construction Advisor at WorkSafe. Good afternoon, James.
G'day, Chris.
And we've got Andrew Taylor, who's WorkSafe's Principal Engineer. Good afternoon, Andrew.
Afternoon, Chris.
Thank you both for joining us today. And we will be taking your audience questions a little bit later on in the webinar. So if you do have a question for James or Andrew now, or if something pops into your mind as we're discussing these topics today, please feel free to pop it into the chat box so it is ready to go once we get to your questions at the end of the webinar. I think we're going to start by taking a look at the most recent industry standard for elevated work platforms. This guidance provides practical advice on the selection and safe use of EWPs across a broad range of industries. James, we might start with you first. Who is the standard for, and what helpful information does Edition 4 contain?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Well, this standard is really for the operators of the mobile elevating work platforms, or EWPs, as you called them at the start. And it's really for people who have responsibilities for managing those hazards and those risks associated with the operation of those EWPs. The standard, it does provide advice on the safe use, the maintenance, as well as the transport of EWPs across a broad range of industries and a broad range of applications. And what helpful information is included? We're talking about training and competencies, so what you'd need to be able to use an EWP safely, and what you'd need to be trained in to safely be an observer for when you're spotting for someone who's using an EWP. Other things that you'll find in there is harness use, so when you need to use one, where you don't have to, and how to wear it and check it for safety. Other things included are collection and delivery. So we're talking about what types of trucks you may need to use, what traffic management you should be considering, training for those delivery personnel, as well as loading, how to secure that EWP down to that truck trailer. We also include some common hazards. So just a few: the overhead structures, overhead power lines, and ground conditions. We also talk about work practices, so no-go zones and when to use an electrical spotter. And finally, we also talk about emergency procedures. So if something goes pear-shaped, how do we get someone down safely and quickly?
Thanks, James. And as we know, there are several different types of elevated work platforms. So what types of EWPs are we talking about here?
So we're talking about vehicle-mounted EWPs, self-propelled EWPs, ones that can be towed behind a car or truck, or also ones that can be moved by hand. And these are largely powered scissor mechanisms, or scissor lifts as we know them, telescoping boom or tower EWPs, so boom lifts or cherry pickers, articulated EWPs, or any combination of those. So it's really a one-stop shop when it comes to EWPs.
Thanks, James. Andrew, coming over to you now. We've talked about training as a key component of risk prevention. What sort of training does someone need to operate an EWP?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, there are several different types of training that are generally required when operating elevating work platforms. First of all, from a licensing requirement, if the EWP is a boom type EWP and has a boom length of more than 11 meters, then a high-risk work license is required. For all other types of EWPs, and to meet the requirements of the OH&S Act 2004, general training should be provided to operators, which should ideally be structured, nationally recognised training that includes assessments overseen by a suitably trained assessor, and those would be applicable for scissor-type EWPs and boom-type EWPs that had a boom length less than 11 metres. Also, as controls and capabilities of EWPs are often different, and operators may not have ever operated a particular type of EWP or have been assessed on a type of EWP because it might be a different make or model of EWP. An important type of training is familiarisation training. This needs to be undertaken to make sure that the operator knows how to operate that specific EWP, knows all the differences with those controls, etc. So when they take a particular action, the EWP operates in the intended and expected way. The final part of the training should include procedures for what to do in an emergency in case the operator becomes sick or incapacitated, and also for those other support personnel that can assist in retrieving a stranded operator or persons within the platform of the elevating work platform.
Thanks, Andrew. One of the risk control measures that the standard mentions and WorkSafe advocates is an operator protective device known as secondary guarding. James, bringing you back in here, could you tell us a little bit about secondary guarding and how it works?
Absolutely. So when we're talking about secondary guarding, we're talking about a safety feature which can be added to the EWP, and this is used to reduce the risk of an operator being crushed or trapped against a fixed overhead structure. Secondary guarding, it can either be fitted from brand new, so on the showroom floor, so to speak, or it can be retrofitted to an EWP that is in your fleet already. So secondary guarding, it applies to most EWPs, and this includes boom type EWPs, so those boomless cherry pickers, that sort of stuff, as well as scissor type EWPs as well. So when we're talking about secondary guarding, we're talking about three forms of secondary guarding. So we're talking about physical barriers, we're talking about pressure sensing devices, and we're also talking about proximity sensing devices. So put really simply, on your EWP, you can install a cage, a crush bar, or a sensor-based control, like a LiDAR type sensor. When it comes to what secondary guarding you need to install, WorkSafe doesn't mind. There isn't a hierarchy, so to speak, but the most important thing is that you are using secondary guarding where there is that risk of being crushed up against a fixed overhead adjacent structure.
And James, how accessible or practical is it to fit secondary guarding? And once it's installed, does it completely eliminate the risk of being crushed between an overhead structure and an EWP, for example?
Yeah, well, secondary guarding, it is quite accessible now and it is quite practical. There are plenty of solutions out there on the market. We're finding that it is being offered by a lot of the original equipment manufacturers, some of those big players that we're all familiar with. And it's also been offered by aftermarket suppliers. There has been a need and a demand for that in the industry. The process is pretty straightforward. If you're buying one off the showroom floor, it should already be fitted. But if you have one in your fleet, you can get people in to come in and install that. And that's straightforward, as I said, and relatively inexpensive. Yes, secondary guarding won't fully eliminate that risk, but we deem it to be a reasonably practical risk control measure that is used to reduce that risk, and therefore it's a worthwhile investment to ensure that workers are getting home safely.
Great, thank you, James. You mentioned the role of a safety observer a bit earlier as a possible prevention. Andrew, could you explain what this is and why it's so important?
Yes, thanks, Chris. As James said, fitting secondary guarding to an EWP when used in an environment where it's the risk of crushing does not eliminate the risk. There is still a risk there of crushing, and there have been fatal incidents that have occurred with secondary guarding fitted to the EWP. Therefore, we need a safety observer to make sure that that particular operator is safe whilst they're going about their work using that EWP. Safety observer is defined in the industry standard, and it requires that the person should have a line of sight to the operator and, if applicable, the other occupants located within the operating EWP. The safety observer must be trained on a specific EWP and licensed where required for the type of EWP being operated. They should also be trained in the emergency rescue procedures for that EWP or EWPs that they are a safety observer for. And they should have the ability to take prompt action to rescue the operators or warn operators of hazards as they are negotiating them on a site whilst using the EWP.
James, are we talking about one observer per operator here?
No, we're not. This is a frequently asked question that Andy and myself get asked a fair bit. So there is no fixed ratio of observers to operators, so there is no one-to-one ratio. But what it boils down to is those points that Andy had raised. So if one of those points are not met or it falls away, throughout that task, that's your cue to reevaluate the number of observers that you have in place. So say, for example, someone can't maintain line of sight between two EWPs at the same time. That's your cue to reevaluate and introduce additional safety observers. And it's just a reminder as well here that secondary guarding is always to be used in conjunction with a safety observer if there is that risk of crushing. So it's not an either-or situation. Both need to be used together.
And you've both mentioned the requirement for training in emergency procedures. James, staying with you, what does that look like exactly?
Well, emergency procedures, they're there to help us out when things go wrong, when things take a turn for the worse, and it's there to ensure that the worker and any occupants in the basket can get down safely and as quickly as possible. We've talked about safety observers, and safety observers are key to emergency procedures because they're often the first person to sort of be there in the event of emergency. So the safety observer needs to have access to procedures as well as anyone else involved in that emergency response. So when we're talking about procedures, what we're expecting or what we should be ensuring are that instructions are available to anyone who's needing to take action in the event of emergency. It's also making sure that that plant-specific training is being provided, as Andy has touched on. If we are using a scissor lift and we're trained in boom lifts, those skills are not always transferable. So we need to make sure that everyone who's involved in the room in the event of emergency knows what they're doing. We also need to make sure that function testing is captured in these emergency procedures. In the event of emergency, you don't want to be finding out that your safety levers and emergency response levers are not working as intended. So it's always good to check those regularly. We also need to consider checking travel paths and checking controls. EWPs like boom lifts can get themselves into some pretty nifty situations and nifty positions out there on sites. And as a result of that, travel paths may not always be completely straightforward. So these need to be considered and incorporated into that emergency procedure. We also want to be considering communications. How are we maintaining communication with people on the ground to the people in the basket? Construction sites, manufacturing facilities, warehouses, demolition sites, these are often really noisy environments, and the height of the EWP can also contribute to that lack of communication between the ground controls and the operator. So ensuring that we have good communication, like a two-way radio, is best. Other things that you might want to be considering, as well as any other equipment that you might need to perform a rescue on your site. So we could be talking about harnesses as an example. So harnesses and double lanyards in the event of emergency where we need to do a platform-to-platform rescue.
Great, thanks, James. Andrew, turning back to you now, I understand you've got a short case study that you can share with the audience and take us through where a number of mistakes were made in relation to the use of an EWP.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, unfortunately, I attended a fatality back in January 2020. It was actually on Australia Day. It involved a scissor type EWP and an operator becoming crushed between a roof truss and the front guardrail of an EWP. Essentially, the job was inside a factory type building where the job was to paint and black out several windows that were in the sawtooth roof to prevent light from entering the environment. To reach that high area, an EWP, scissor type EWP, was used to gain access. On the day of the incident, there were two people on site. One person was painting in a nearby room behind a door, and then there was the second person who was the EWP operator. Once each window was painted, the EWP operator had to lower the scissor type EWP until he cleared the bottom chord of the roof truss, then would travel underneath the bottom chord and then re-raise the EWP to a level where he could paint the next window. Unfortunately, and we could tell this by looking at CCTV that was in place at the time, he wasn't lowering the platform all the way to the ground. He was leaving it raised slightly, and just sliding underneath each bottom cord of the truss. What happened was when he thought he was clear of one of the cords, he began to raise the platform, and unfortunately hadn't cleared that, and that resulted in a crush between the bottom cord and the platform, the guardrail platform. Approximately 5 minutes went by before the second person that was painting in another room actually identified that of the situation. And with that person rushing to the aid of the person that was trapped, he didn't know how to operate the EWP to lower that particular person to alleviate the pressure. What generally happened was that it took some time for the EWP to reconfigure the control system between platform controls and ground controls. And the flick of the switch, the person was becoming impatient trying to get it down, and in the end gave up and called the emergency services. A few minutes went by before the bystander identified the emergency retrieval controls and was able to release that and bring the platform down gradually. However, it was too late then. So with this particular EWP, there was no secondary guarding device fitted and no safety observer. Also, there was no emergency procedures in place, nor was there anyone there to operate that EWP in an emergency to bring that particular person down. So it was a tragic circumstances, and that's why, and a good example of why these particular sets of guidance have been put together on the safe use of EWPs.
Thanks for sharing that with us, Andrew. James, coming back to you now, what kinds of challenges or hurdles could some of our audience be facing around the safe use of EWPs?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I suppose the first step would be trying to get the EWP itself. So whenever you're reaching out to hire an EWP from a supplier or from a hire yard, just make sure that you're being clear with them about what work you're undertaking, what the ground looks like, whether you're working against any fixed overhead adjacent structures. So they're clear on what you need to do and what safety precautions or what safety equipment may need to be provided or fitted to that EWP. So from there, they should be able to choose the most appropriate EWP type for the task, such as one that's an all-terrain scissor lift or one that's been fitted with secondary guarding. The next point I'd probably raise is around competency in training and licensing. So as Andrew touched on before, just because you're licensed or trained in one type of EWP does not necessarily mean that you're competent in another. A scissor lift and a boom type are completely different items of plant. There's different inherent risks, different movements, different controls. And as I said before, these skills are not always transferable between different types of plant. So making sure that you take your time, get everyone trained up in that particular type of plant is the best way to go about things. Also, when things take a turn for the worse, you need to make sure that everyone involved in the emergency response and the emergency procedures are also trained and competent and licensed if relevant. When things take that turn, you want to make sure that people on the ground know how to use the ground controls and are operating that with the best of intentions and the best of knowledge. As we talked about, EWPs are a fantastic falls from height solution. They can get us out of a lot of difficult situations and provide great solutions, but they are not without their own hazards and risks. And that's why we need to make sure that whenever we are using them, we're taking all the precautions, we're fitting them off with the right equipment, and we're not operating these EWPs alone, as Andrew's case study pointed out. Yeah.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Andrew. Some really good insights there. And I think it is now time for us to start taking some of your questions in the audience. So if you do have a question for James or Andrew, our experts are in the room. So if you've got a question that's been burning, you've been wanting to ask for a while, now is your chance. Pop it into the chat box on your screen and we'll get to it before we wrap things up today. We do have plenty of questions coming through, but if you've got one, pop it into the chat box now and we will get to it. So I think we'll kick off with the question that's getting the most likes so far, boys. The question is a spotter mandatory with the use of an EWP? Now, we covered off the use of a spotter earlier, but James, we might come to you on that one. Is this something that is mandatory and workplaces have to have in place?
It's something that needs to be in place. we can't go so far to say as it's mandatory, because it's not explicitly stated in the laws and legislation. So we say that it is a reasonably practicable risk control measure and it needs to be in place. And I suppose that's the sort of nuance that we're talking about there, that it needs to be in place, but we can't call it mandatory because it is not explicitly stated in our legislation.
Thanks, James. Andrew, just coming to you on that point, as James said, it's not set out explicitly in our laws, in the Act or regulations, but employers do have an obligation to do everything that's reasonably practicable to keep their workers safe, don't they?
Yeah, that's correct. The EWP industry standard is a form of guidance which is called state of knowledge information. So employers need to be aware of that existence of that guidance, and should the unfortunate incident happen or those circumstances happen, as I described earlier, in a prosecution, the legal team will bring that out to say this is what industry should know about. This is readily available on the website. So when people are developing their systems of work, they need to have a notice in regard to this sort of guidance that WorkSafe have put out.
Thanks, Andrew. That's good. That's really good advice. James, we've got another question here that's getting quite a few likes. In what scenarios or situations can you or should you be stepping out of a raised EWP? Now, obviously, EWPs in some situations will be used to get workers to a certain height to work from somewhere else. Is that okay? And what kinds of things should employers be taking into consideration if that's going to be done?
Yeah, this is a question we get asked a fair bit, Andy and I. The truth of the matter is EWPs shouldn't really be getting exited from while they're at elevated height. They're there to provide that height safety solution, but they're not there to be a means of access or egress. There is and I can't emphasize this enough, a very, very small amount of scenarios when it is the safest option to be exiting the EWP to gain access to a building or structure. But we find that those situations are very few and far between. I've been working at WorkSafe for around 7 years and I haven't come across one yet. And he might have some more stories. He's been around a little bit longer than I. But there is an Australian standard which goes through and talks about what you'd need to consider. I think from memory, Andy, what is it? It's 40...
Australian Standard 2550 Part 10 lays out a process of how to go about doing that. And there's a whole heap of checks that needs to be done. And the very first line of that Australian Standard process talks about that only proceed to point 2 if you've been able to demonstrate that all other forms of access have proved to be not reasonably practical. It is the safest means of access. And some people may ignore that one, but really it's looking at that and going, yeah, I think in this instance, I can use a scaffold for this particular access. EWPs are defined to provide a safe working environment to work at height, not to gain access to somewhere. Using an EWP is a level 2 control. It's got guardrails all the way around it. As soon as you step from that, potentially across a gap and onto another level, you're suddenly relying on harnesses. It's a lower order control, and if anything was to go wrong there, especially because the EWPs can move as force is applied to them when someone steps from or to an EWP, things can go wrong. So we'd always try and persuade people to assess the risks and work out whether it is actually the safest option. If it is proved to be so, yes, there is a procedure that can be followed in the Elevated Work Platform Australian Standard, AS 2550 Part 10.
Excellent, very detailed knowledge. Thank you for that, Andrew. Another question here in relation to for EWPs under 11 metres. What deems an operator or safety observer competent? Can organisations rely on RTO/association provided yellow card as a proof of competency? Andrew, I might kick that one to you.
Yes, yeah. Well, certainly there's no Horace Work licence for those particular categories. And yes, I think the yellow card, like the EWPA yellow card, is a training option that can be used, and it is actually mentioned in the WorkSafe EWP industry standard, and certainly they can use that. Part of that training and RTO training should be how to use that EWP safely, and also how to use its emergency retrieval controls and devices. And yes, people can rely on that. One of the things that I would throw into that, just as a general learning, is making sure that the retrieval controls aren't boxed in by the environment, that people can actually get to them. Sometimes EWPs are positioned in a way that they're against a wall, and that coincidentally might be the side where the emergency retrieval devices are located. So it's always make sure that they are available to people, because even if those particular support personnel are trained, if they can't get to the retrieval devices, we've got to look for a plan B. So it's all in the planning.
Thanks, mate.
Might also, sorry, Chris.
James, jump in, mate.
I might also add there is also that make and model, that plant familiarization training that employers would also need to be providing to their employees. So once we have them on site, different makes and different models can be different, even amongst the same scissor lift design type, or the same boom lift design type. That there are certain differences and certain sort of nuances of each make and model. So we need to be providing that plant familiarization training at that work site level.
Thanks, James. And a related question that's come through as well, speaking about if you have a license for greater than 11 metres, is it safe to assume you're competent to operate or spot for an EWP of less than 11 metres? But I think, as you said there, James, as long as you've had the relevant training for the specific type of EWP, that should be the case. But Andrew, might get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's the case. Certainly for familiarization training, yes, you need to know the ins and outs of that particular machine that you're being the safety observer for. Certainly, you do need training or assessments on those EWPs that are below 11 metres for boom types and scissors. When you do get your Horace Work license for a boom type EWP that's over 11 metres, that's all that training discusses. So they won't include the nuances associated with operating a scissor lift. So it shouldn't be taken that just because I have a work platform boom type EWP Horace Work license over 11 metres that I'm competent to operate scissor types and tracked scissor type EWPs, etc. There's a lot more to them. So we'd certainly encourage the training as we detailed earlier.
Thanks, Andrew. James, we spoke about earlier the use of spotters, particularly when there's a risk of crushing with an EWP. Questions come through here asking, do we need a spotter if there is no risk of crushing?
Yes, it's also another frequently asked question that Andy and I get a fair bit out on site. The truth of the matter is that fixed overhead adjacent structures aren't the only hazard out there on construction sites, demo sites, manufacturing sites, whatever it may be. There are also a range of different sorts of ground conditions, as an example, is something that we need to take into consideration. Ground conditions, pockets, steps and slabs and that sort of stuff. So really the spotter isn't just there, or the safety observer isn't just there to make sure that you're not getting too close to the rafters or to the cords, but also make sure that whenever you're using and whenever you're sort of traveling about in these EWPs, that you're doing so in the safe possible way and avoiding any of those hazards that we just talked about.
Great, thank you, James. Andrew, a slightly tricky question coming through, but we'll try and answer this one. Why don't all EWPs require a high risk license?
Yes, well, that's a good question. The Horace Work licensing scheme is a national scheme. It's run and administered by Safe Work Australia. They have various measures and justification tools to warrant an EWP. And I think many people would see an EWP with a boom type of 10 metres have similar risks and issues as compared to one that's greater than 11 metres. But these things are are often reviewed, and high-risk work licenses are being reviewed on a national level at the moment to try and make them a little bit more easier to understand and work with. But at the moment, the national rule is what we work with. So whether you're in Western Australia or Queensland, yes, you need that license for a boom type over 11 metres. And yeah, we continue to work with Safe Work Australia to try and refine those high-risk work licenses as time goes on.
Great, thanks, Andrew. James, I think we covered this one off a little bit earlier, but we do have a question coming through and a few likes. So let's just go through it again. In terms of safety observers or spotters, as they're being described in the question here, do they need the nationally recognised training if they're going to be working as a safety observer?
Yeah, so whatever the person in the basket has, good rule of thumb is to make sure that that safety observer has the same thing. As I've talked about before, when things go pear-shaped, when things take a turn for the worse, we've got to make sure that we have the best people in the room to be able to enact those emergency procedures and respond so in the safe and quickest way possible. So put simply, yes, they do.
Great. Thank you, James. Andrew, we've got another question coming here in relation to the use of safety observers / spotters and whether they're mandatory. We did just cover this question off a little bit earlier, but I'll ask this one because there's a slightly different angle to this question. And it talks about the industry standard, stipulating that safety observers and spotters should be appointed. However, should in the key terms indicates an optional course of action. Could you please advise on what that is and as we said before, the importance of safety observers?
Yeah, thanks. It goes to what James said earlier. With state of knowledge guidance, we can include musts and shalls if it's an explicit legislative requirement, but only provide recommendations or needs to terms in the guidance if it's something that's not prescriptively mandated by legislation. So that's why those terms are used. Again, it's up to the individual person that's planning that job to take heed of the state of knowledge guidance because it exists. They need to be aware of it. But you know, if someone can develop a safe system of work that meets or exceeds what's laid out in the EWP industry standard, certainly that will be acceptable as long as the rationale and the justification is there for it.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. James, we spoke earlier about traffic management plans, which are really important for the use of EWPs. A question coming through here, what traffic management needs to be in place for EWPs working around other persons on site or the general public? Is bollarded flagging adequate around the machine and seclusion zone under the basket? Is that enough?
Well, I'm sorry to give you guys a cute answer, but it really depends on the your workplace environment. You could imagine, you know, if you're working in a warehouse versus you and another colleague, as an example, the traffic management requirements wouldn't be as stringent compared to if you're working next to a live roadway where you have cars and buses and whatnot traveling around. So it really comes down to what your workplace environment looks like. And you probably need to do that sort of assessment of the risk to make sure that whatever you have got is fit for purpose. And you also want to be considering as well who else is around. If you're working on a construction site where most people are pretty familiar with the operations of an EWP, you wouldn't need to put as stringent controls in compared to if you're working in a shopping centre where there's plenty of kids about and different sorts of people. So sorry for the cute answer, but it really depends on your workplace environment. But yeah, I encourage everyone to go through and do their risk assessments in consultation with their colleagues, their employees, and their HSRs, of course.
Thanks, James. In relation to risk assessments, Andrew, a question here, is a plant risk assessment required for a brand new EWP and what types of things should duty holders be considering if they're bringing in a new piece of equipment like an EWP into their workplace?
Yes, so risk assessments as a term was taken out of legislation a number of years ago. So there is no requirement to undertake a risk assessment on an item of plant. However, hazard ID is required and control of risk is required. So when introducing a new item of plant to the site, you should look at the manual, which will dictate and explain all the risks associated with the use of that plant. The manufacturer should have gone through all that, and it's in the manual. So that's something that can be looked at. The one thing that the supplier of the EWP cannot often foresee is the environment in which it's being operated. So that's to the duty holder that's using that EWP, that there might be some risks associated with the environment and the EWP used in that environment that the duty holder needs to do that hazard ID for, and obviously put in the risk controls. But in most circumstances, the manual will cover off most of the hazards and risks associated with the use of that EWP.
And James, a question here in relation to documentation, and I think, as you would appreciate, many construction sites have contractors, subcontractors, principal contractors. If a subcontractor, for example, is going to be using an EWP on another contractor's site, how do they need to let them know of that? Is there any documentation they need to be sharing, and what information do they need to be sharing with the principal contractor on site?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Chris. So when we have a look at construction sites, we're assuming here that the principal contractor has the overall management and control of that workplace, and they would likely have their own systems of work, their own safety standards and procedures that they would be following. So that would be passed down to the subcontractor to say that, hey, if you're working on my particular site, this is what I'd be expecting, that all EWPs will have secondary guarding. As an example, you'll have your swims in place because that is required. So that PC will go through and confirm and I suppose set the standard of what is expected. And could you please repeat the question? Thank you, Chris.
I can. Just in relation to the information and documentation that maybe should be shared across contractors there.
Yeah, so it really comes down to what the PC has deemed to be minimum standards for their particular workplace. Including their safe work method statement, having sure that manufacturer's instructions and those supplier instructions are known and kept and communicated through. These are the things that we'll be expecting, yeah.
Excellent. Andrew, we spoke a little bit earlier about the use of EWPs in terms of working safely at height, but not so much for transporting people to heights. Question coming through here, is it acceptable to use an EWP to transport building materials or other equipment, for example, up to a higher level?
Yes, EWPs are designed for that. They have a rated capacity which limits, obviously, the amount of materials that can be lifted up there. But in an ideal situation, you may, for instance, have a scissor lift. Let's say it's filled with a number of solar panels that a person operates to raise up the side of a building, and they meet and align with the roof line, and people that are on the roof may be protected with or by guard railing on that roof, and they've got full protection. So then it's just a matter of the person in the platform passing over that material onto the person on the roof, and both people in that, whether they're in the EWP or on the roof, they're both provided with full protection, and that's purely fine. There is generally speaking, there are risk controls that mean that you can't overload the EWPs. They won't raise if there's too much weight in them, and that's all part of the EWP and the design standard of EWPs to make sure that that's the case. But certainly, yes, you can use EWPs to transfer materials to a higher level.
And James, we spoke about earlier emergency procedures and making sure people on site are trained for what might go wrong in an emergency. A question here that's come through, is there any guidance available for duty holders in relation to a platform-to-platform rescue, for example?
It would be included in the industry standard, and it would also be included in the Australian standards. That's probably the best places to be going through and have a look. If you need any further information, feel free to reach out to advisory, and Andy or myself can also sort of sit down with you, have a phone call conversation, and give you guys a few tips and tricks on what else to be considering. But I'll start there.
Great. Thanks, James. Andrew, coming to you now, we've got a question about verification of competency. What is the requirement for a VOC for an operator of an EWP that already has a license? Who can conduct them?
Yeah, so we don't have any guidance, or nor is it within any legislation regarding verification of competency. My experience is that there are a wide variety of quality of verification of competencies. Some people do it good in a good way. Some people not so good. So it can vary. A lot of clients will require VOCs, as they're called, before they operate items of plant, and it's certainly a good idea to make sure that the people that say that they can operate a certain type of EWP can actually do that and operate and have some kind of an assessment before. But we don't mandate any standards along those lines. But for a safety observer purpose, of course, yes, it's a matter of asking the person to be familiarized with the emergency retrieval devices and actually seeing those practiced and the functions actually used. I think there's a number of our inspectors as well that will often stop or briefly stop an activity on site that's using an EWP, just to make sure that that particular safety observer can actually do that and actually know where they're going. And obviously, if the safety observer runs to the wrong side of the machine and they're scratching their head, we know we've got a problem. But generally speaking, it's good for all those people that have got responsibilities with the safe use of EWPs on site to do these sort of spot checks, and that works in with VOCs as well, just to make sure that the people that have those particular responsibilities and duties on site can actually do so in the case of an emergency.
And James, I think we covered this point off a little earlier, but we do have a question, so I think we can just squeeze it in before we wrap up, and it just relates to safety observers. When is a situation when a safety observer can spot for multiple EWPs? Is that something that is okay in certain situations?
Yeah, so I'm a Sparky by trade, so I'll use an example from my background. So whenever we're pulling in cables in a building site, pulling them across some cable tray for a large warehouse, we would often have two EWPs at height pulling through cables from one side to the other. In those sort of large warehouses, and in those places where you can maintain that line of contact when someone's able to take effective prompt action, able to maintain that communication, in those scenarios, that's when you can have more than one EWP to an operator. But if that goes through to a different part of the warehouse or a different part of the building, whatever it may be, and as I said before, one of those points falls away, that's your cue then to reevaluate.
It's great advice, James. And thank you, Andrew, our WorkSafe Victoria experts, for joining us today. We really appreciate you sharing your insights and examples and explaining the safe use of EWPs. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, Chris.
And we hope you have found this a very interesting and informative session. This webinar will be available on WorkSafe's website in the coming weeks. So we very much value your opinion on our Health and Safety Month events. So shortly we'll be sending you an online survey. Please provide your feedback so we can incorporate your suggestions into our program next year. All respondents will be going into the draw to win one of 5 $100 gift cards. And we'll shortly show on screen a list of all the contacts or programs that we have covered off today. If you've got any further requests for information, we recommend you get in touch. Remember, if there is something you want to discuss, the WorkSafe advisory line is open from 7:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. Monday to Friday, and WorkSafe's emergency line is there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar.